Good morning. We're going to get the program started. Thank you for being here. My name is Kevin Greiner. I serve as President and CEO of Gas South, and am privileged to also serve as the chair of the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education, a really great group that I've had the privilege of working with the staff, learning a lot more about education policy in the great state of Georgia, and trying to make a difference in our state in terms of improving the quality of education, stretching from early childhood education all the way up through higher education. And the topic today is one that personally is really important to me, one that I'm really passionate about. We're going to be talking about economic opportunity and the role of education in helping to create it. I do want to thank AT&T for serving as a sponsor of today's forum, and also for the Federal Reserve for hosting us. Let's give them a big round of applause. So when you look at education and opportunity, prosperity and growth, and the topics that we're going to talk about today, at Gas South, one of the things that I enjoy most about my job is creating opportunities for our employees. And we have about 200 employees, and what I like about that is it's large enough where there's a career path and there are great opportunities for folks to pursue at our company, but we're small enough that I get to know all of our employees, and I get to understand their family situations, their opportunities, their aspirations, and their challenges. And one of the things that I find most gratifying is when we're able to bring that person into our company who comes from a background where they didn't have the same privileges and advantages that I and many of my colleagues did, and they overcome the odds and they make it happen. And they grow their careers at Gas South and potentially grow their careers at other places. And a lot of times I see these cases of folks who did grow up in poverty. And they might start in our customer care organization, and they work on their degree, and they get it, and they work their way up, and they become managers at Gas South, and suddenly you realize, we really had a role as a company to break the cycle of poverty and to create opportunity. And when I see these individuals come to work every day and succeed and be the first ones that went to college, and maybe the first ones that actually really were able to support their families, and to even support their parents and their grandparents, it really is inspirational, and it makes me realize how easy I had it, quite frankly, in terms of making my way in life. And I take a huge amount of inspiration from these folks day in and day out, and I'm just so privileged to be able to lead that team and see them take that path towards success, and really, it's obviously a cliche, but really live the American dream. So this topic is really, really important to me. Now, I'm also realistic, though, enough to know that for every person at Gas South that experienced this sort of upward mobility and overcame the odds and were able to make it happen, for every person like that, there are dozens that never break that cycle and are never able to have the right breaks, the right opportunity, find themselves in the right place at the right time, have that tenacity that you need to have to really break through that cycle and change their lives, and quite honestly, the lives of their kids and their kids, and so on and so on. So this program is really going to be focused on talking about what is education's role in being able to break that cycle, and to break that cycle in a much more to break that cycle much more often than what we're typically seeing. In Georgia, of course, unfortunately, we have the distinction of being one of those states that has the lowest level of economic mobility, i.e. the ability to move from one economic strata up to another. And that's a list that we certainly don't want to be on. That's the list that we don't want to lead. And I think education provides the means to change that and to improve significantly in terms of economic mobility. I'm going to call on now Marie Gooding. She's the first Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank, and she is going to provide a welcome. Marie, thanks again for hosting us today.
Thank you. Well, I want to welcome you to the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. We're one of the 12 regional reserve banks. We basically serve the bulk of the Southeast, all of Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, and parts of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Tennessee. So a couple of opening comments. Just, I want to apologize for my shoes. It is not casual day here. I'm nursing a fractured bone, and this time I'm listening to the doctor, and so I did not change out of my shoes. This is an upgrade. I had a boot on for about 4 weeks, but so it's an upgrade, but just bear with me on that. The other thing I want to do is thank you for your patience in getting through our security. We thought about giving you a prize for making it through that first step, but I do want to acknowledge that it is, we want to continue to host meetings here, but we are in a state of continued vigilant security, so we very much appreciate your patience in getting through the building, and congratulations on that as well. Today's forum is focused on issues of opportunity, prosperity, and growth. And that's issues that we're certainly interested in here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. In fact, all of our Federal Reserve offices are interested in these issues. But our researchers here deeply study the dynamics of economic growth, the labor market, and monetary policy in order to support meeting our dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices. So these are also very important issues to members of our Community and Economic Development Group, and that group focuses on economic issues in low and moderate income communities across our district. Key areas of focus for that Community Economic Development Group are human capital, workforce development, and education as tools to create opportunity for workers, prosperity in communities, and economic growth more broadly. And education is a key. You're going to have the opportunity to hear from my colleague, Dave Altig, in a moment on how our economists see some of these trends. And then he will be followed by a panel of local experts engaged in supporting our schools in being places that build opportunity and skills for young people. I know that the panelists are going to be asked what can be expected of schools. I hear this in my own conversations. Can they do it all themselves, or will it take the community and partnerships more broadly to serve all students and to enhance opportunities? I'm going to reflect as a former Georgia public school teacher before having a couple of careers and then coming to the Fed, and also having the privilege over the last 8 years to work with communities and schools of Georgia and the Georgia Council on Economic Education. I can attest to you that we faced many challenges, and I know that those of you in this room know that. And it's going to require all of us. There is not a shortage of work to be done to address all the challenges that we have and move toward improvements in overcoming some of the issues that we have. Finally, I want to thank the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education for partnering with us on this forum, and our panelists in offering their insights on this important topic. I personally am really looking forward to today's forum, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you to everyone at the Fed for, again, agreeing to host us today. It's a great space, and we have a great turnout. I'm going to call now to the podium Steve Dollinger. He is the president of our Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education. He's going to be providing the president's report. But while Steve is making his way up to the stage, we also want to ask Dennis Boyden from AT&T. He serves as the regional director there, to come forward for a special presentation.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to represent AT&T today. My state director, Rich Johnson, really wanted to be here today, but Marie, he's taken your advice as well. His doctor and the flu told him to stay home. So that's what he is doing today. But I would just like to say on behalf of AT&T that I am a longtime employee having come through Southern Bell, Bell South, and now AT&T. And regardless of the company, the commitment to education was always there and is today. I see Phil Jacobs, who was our state president when we were Bell South, worked very closely with the governor and his team toward addressing education issues. Our first president for AT&T Georgia, the new AT&T Georgia, Sylvia Russell, worked very closely with the governor, advocate for education, and definitely a supporter of this organization. And I think what that says, the fact that Phil has retired and is doing other things, Sylvia has retired and is doing other things, the fact that they are here today lets you know that the commitment from them at that time was not about position, but about their own personal commitment toward education. So it is with great pleasure today that I'm making a presentation on behalf of AT&T. But I also would like to say in regard to Dr. Stephen Dolinger, I first met him when he was Fulton County Schools superintendent. And at that time, I was actively engaged with the South Fulton Chamber. We referred to him as the CEO of Fulton County Schools because he did an outstanding job of presenting the X's and O's of the fact that he was a transportation director with school buses. He was in the food services in that he provided meals every day. And he was just a pleasure to work with because he clearly understood it. And I'll go a step further to say that if it wasn't for the politics engaged, I know of no better person to have one time been the state superintendent of schools than Dr. Stephen Dolinger. Just a fact. So here's you, Dr. Dolinger. But as Phil did during his time, as Sylvia did during her time, we also know that the great work of this organization cannot go on without funding. So it is for that reason that I am here today on behalf of our Southeastern Regional President, Bill Leahy, and Rich Johnson, along with Phil Jacobs and Sylvia Russell, to make this check presentation in the amount of $15,000 to support your annual efforts to improve education in the state of Georgia. I'd just like to ask, can we get Phil and Sylvia on the picture?
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We are blessed to have good supporters and good funders. And Dennis, yeah, we go back decades. It's nice to kind of look at your life in chunks of decades. I don't think either one of us had quite so many gray hairs back then, but we have been friends for a long time. Thank you very much for those kind words and for the presentation and for AT&T's continued support. Let me go through briefly what you have in your packet and say a few things, update about the partnership so you'll know what we're still up to, and then we'll jump into the program. On the right side there, you have the agenda. Of course, you've seen that, so you can see what the program's all about. Then you have on the gray sheets the bios. You know our style is to give you the lengthy bios here that you can read, but when the guests come up, we do that rather quickly just to kind of keep the program going, so you can see how impressive our guests are today. And thanks again, Kevin mentioned this, but thanks to the Federal Reserve Bank for hosting this meeting today. We've been, long time, been friends with them. It's nice to be partnered on an important, critical issue like this one. And of course, again, to AT&T for sponsoring all of our forums this year. Next is an article by Dr. Dana Rickman, our Director of Policy and Research. This was the September-October issue of James Magazine. We're really grateful that they ask us to do an article for them just about every issue. You probably noticed Dana's not with us today. She's on an adventure, we call it. She's doing presentations of economics education to 2 different classes, one yesterday and one today down in South Georgia for the Georgia Academy of Economic Developers. So she's helping us with that. Diane does most of those classes, but Dana pinched it for us today. If you want to connect more closely with us, there's a sheet there that you could fill out and leave here, and then you get invitations to these events and any of our policy briefs or other electronic transmissions we do, blasts that we do regularly. You may want to take a look at those. And then, as the president, I need to let you know that you do have an opportunity to give to the Georgia Partnership in addition to AT&T. You can even surpass AT&T's gift if you'd like to. But you can do it in the envelope, or you can go to our website and do that electronically. By the way, today is Georgia Gives Day. Some of the things the partnership is up to, we are continuing to do our work with economics of education. I just mentioned that with Dana on the road. We're in the process of rewriting that now for the 5th edition. You know, we keep that pretty fresh, and as we go across the state doing the presentations, we update the data with the slides. We're kind of paranoid about wanting the data as fresh as it can be. But you'll see in the new year, when we put out the new Econ of Ed, it may not be that hard publication we've had in the past. It may be more a smaller document with more of the data pieces, some of the slides, and a little narrative, but there may be series of briefs that will come out during the year, actually picking up a strategy from our friends here at the Feds that do those kinds of periodic announcements. We're working with our inventory of assessments. We're working with 5 school districts across the state to really do kind of an analysis how much testing is going on. How much is federal, how much is state, how much is local. And of course, we're finding out most of it's local. Most school systems are doing it to themselves, but there's all that gnashing about over-testing and how much time it's taken from instruction. So we're helping these districts field test a model that then could be replicated across other school systems in the state to do that assessment, come to grips with how much testing is really necessary, really appropriate, then how to use the data. And we're already seeing signs that these school systems are going to want some more training and help, which we'll pass that off to some of our colleagues. We are working now on the 13th edition of our Top 10 Issues to Watch. That'll come out the first Friday in January with our annual media symposium. We have many of our reporter colleagues here today who will be attending that. We'll have some guest speakers to help the reporters with that messaging. But the topic that we're talking about today, you will see as one of those top 10. And there's some additional information, some publications on your table from the Atlanta Fed. If you'd like to take any of those with you, please do. It's just some more really good information. Well, let's start talking more about today's program. That's what we're really here for. Kevin has said it, Maria said it. This is really a very important topic. The partnership, we're talking more and more about the issues of equity. And we're also looking at the issue of the gaps. We use that in plural, not just the traditional conversation about achievement gaps, but opportunity gaps, gaps in child well-being, mental health support. Those all are issues that get involved in what we call that birth-to-work pipeline. But as we work with a lot of communities, it's interesting to hear them say finally that, well, Steve, it's really not a linear process. Isn't it really cyclical? That if you have adults who go on to college, graduate from high school, go on to college, that they are then able perhaps to be better parents, that have healthier kids, that are ready for kindergarten and so on. So yes, it is quite cyclical. The part that concerns us is that cycle hums pretty well sometimes, but there are too many people that drop out of that cycle and get in a smaller cycle that they can't get out of, and that's that cycle of persistent poverty. And how do we break out of that? We've been alluding to that all morning. With the Opportunity School District Amendment not passing, a lot of people are saying, so what? What now? We may hear some of that conversation from our panel members, but we're talking about that, the partnership. There's 2 good things that happened even though that bill failed. One is that it prompted some superintendents to get more aggressive in making sure they can take some of those schools that were labeled failing off the list. And it has a lot of people now in the conversation of what next. We'll hear some of that today. But having an undergraduate in business and economics makes me start looking at root causes, and we need to really look at defining the problem. Are these schools really failing? Or are they doing quite well? And if they weren't doing as well, we might even have a lower graduation rate than we have at those schools. So are the schools performing as well as they can or not? That's the first determinant. And then we may have to look at the communities. Are the communities doing all that they can, or are they failing? It's very difficult for a school to outperform its community. So what can we all do together? So when Marie was saying that we all have to work together, we really do, because some of these communities can't do it alone. They can't help themselves out of that persistent cycle of poverty. Well, what's impressive with what the feds are doing, they're looking at that also economically. This is where we come together in our partnership. So I'm pleased to invite Dr. David Altig up to give us some real current information on the economic part of this. As you read from the bio, Dave is a businessman, he's an economist, he's a researcher, he's a professor. But I always try to look for some things that we have in common. We both have undergrad in business and econ. We served on the Fed's Education, Health, and Advisory Committee together for a couple of years. It's interesting, though, that we both have 6 grandchildren. Those are important pieces. David, come on up.
We're on now? So let me add my welcome to you to the Atlanta Fed. I'm the director of research here. So I guess the important piece of that is that in our research function is housed 2 different types of activities. One type of activity is the economist and our business outreach people who basically, at the end of the day, our job is to prepare the president, Dennis, to head off to Washington to vote on interest rates and whatever else they vote on. The other bit is our community development function, which of course is, there's one of those in every reserve bank in the system. And the job of that group is to address issues in our communities, particularly those related to low and moderate income populations. The thing that unites those 2 activities, right in the middle of it, is issues related to human capital development, the performance of labor markets, and everything that's involved in those. Because we could do neither one of our jobs without having a pretty firm understanding of the underlying dynamics of labor markets across the spectrum. So I'm going to actually be wearing my research hat a little bit, and I'm going to give you a more or less kind of random pieces of information that we are sitting and staring at now in the research department to try to figure out what we know about the performance of labor markets in the United States at the moment and what we can do about it. What we can do about it through the conduct of monetary policy and what we can't do about it through the conduct of monetary policy, the parts that we're actually handing off to you. So let me start with this picture. If you look at sort of take the broadest view you possibly could, labor markets in the United States are performing quite well. This is payroll employment, monthly payroll employment. I'm giving you sort of 2 pictures here. But by the way, so I am an academic, not only by background, but also just by mentality. So I'm used to being interrupted. I'm also used to being ignored. But if you have questions, I'll try to leave some time for Q&A at the end. But if you have questions along the way, stop me. So this is monthly payroll employment. The orange dash line is monthly data. Kind of ignore that. It's very noisy. It bumps up and down. The line we always look at is the purple line there. The purple line is just the 12-month average of monthly job gains. So we had been running at about 200,000 jobs a month for many years. We are clearly on a trajectory downward from that. That's not anything of particular concern to us. We came out of the recession with a great deficit of jobs, so we expected to grow at a pretty rapid clip. And as things normalize, we expected that to slow down. So right now, the pace looks something like probably like the 1 month rate or a 3-month rate, something around 160,000 jobs a month. Is 160,000 jobs a month good? Well, I guess you got to define what you mean by good, but by my definition, it's good. So here's how we define it as we think about policy. How many jobs do you have to create per month to keep the unemployment rate constant, to keep the unemployment rate from going up? That number is something like 85,000 to 100,000 jobs a month. So if you're running 50% higher than that at least, that's pretty good performance and should be enough to continue to draw people into the roles of employment and reduce the unemployment rate. So, not surprisingly, with the job performance we've had, the unemployment rate has come down. So I've given you 2 unemployment rates here, and I think at this point probably people are pretty familiar with these labels. U3 is the official unemployment rate, one that's 5%, or 4.9% now. One of the things we clearly discovered over the course of the last decade is that maybe that official unemployment rate is a little unsatisfactory when we want to ask a question like, how well is the labor market doing? Because it basically only counts a certain amount of people we think we might actually want to count. So you know how this works. The official unemployment rate is how many people are unemployed relative to the labor force, where the labor force is defined as anyone who has a job or anyone who has looked for a job in the last 4 weeks, roughly speaking. And we never really used to think about unemployment in terms much different than that. But one of the things that we've discovered over time is that if we looked at a somewhat different unemployment rate, we might get a somewhat different picture. So that's what U6 is. U6 is this measure that includes 2 populations as unemployed that aren't counted as unemployed in the official narrow statistic. One, it includes people we call marginally attached. They're people who looked for a job in the last 12 months, but for whatever reason didn't in the last month. So they're kind of in the labor force, they just didn't happen to get counted in the last month, but really they're in the game. They're really participants in the labor force. So the U6 measure counts them as unemployed. It also counts people as unemployed who are involuntarily underemployed, you might say. So the way the official unemployment statistic works is if you work 1 hour, you're employed. That's a job. That's hours worked. Now there's a bunch of people obviously who don't work, who may work 1 hour or who work part-time, defined as 35 hours or less, who want to work full-time, they just can't get full-time work. Call those the part-time for economic reasons. They're thrown in as unemployed in U6. So actually, my remarks are really going to be about these unemployment statistics. And I'm going to kind of feature 2 elements of these statistics I show you. One is the gap between U3 and U6 up there, the narrow definition of unemployment and the broader definition of unemployment. And the other is this fact that the unemployment rate has flattened out, which is a bit peculiar because remember I just told you that the number of jobs that you need to keep the unemployment rate from changing is about 85,000 we think, but we've gone the entire year with no change in the unemployment rate despite the fact that we're creating jobs at a much greater pace than 85,000 jobs a month. So we've been thinking hard about what that could possibly mean. So let me go to this first issue, the gap between U6 and U3 first. So if we go back to 2007, so we go back to right before the recession, the gap between the broad measure of unemployment and the narrow measure of unemployment was about 3.7 percentage points. Is my mic turned on? Was I supposed to turn it on? Somebody's counting on me to do this stuff. I told you I'm a professor. I don't know how to do these. Oh, there we go. You could hear me back there, couldn't you? Yeah. But now it's the voice of God. This is good. So 3.7 percentage points. Oh, I really, I do like that much better. Here's where we are now, almost a full percentage point higher. How should we think about that? So one way to think about it, and actually the way we've thought about it for quite a long time, is that the fact that this gap is so large relative to what it was before the recession means we still have some work to do. Most of that gap is people who are involuntarily part-time, people who want to work full-time but are only able to get part-time work. So maybe if, as monetary policymakers, we push a little bit harder. So here's really how we sort of think about the question. We think about the question is, does this have to do with cyclical things? That is, not enough activity that could be fixed by monetary policy? Or does it have to do with structural things that monetary policy can't fix that have to be handed over to the educators, to the workforce development people, whoever, the social science, the social workers, whoever it might be. So for a long time, we were sort of presuming that this is likely to be symptomatic of more work to be done by monetary policy. But of course, as we get further and further in the game, the question becomes, well, maybe this is structural. That is, should we expect this gap to fall back to the way it looked before the recession? And we're beginning to wonder whether the answer to that isn't, well, maybe not. And here's sort of the question. Can we convert some more of those part-timers to full-timers if just the economy keeps cranking on a little faster? And here's a reason to be somewhat skeptical. This is a picture of the probability of someone who is part-time and wants to be full-time actually transitioning into full-time work. That probability has been not getting better as the economy has strengthened. It's continued to fall. And in fact, in the last year, it's fallen quite noticeably. It sort of stalled out for a while, but now it's commenced to go downwards. This smells like a structural problem. What is that structural problem? Well, when you go out and talk to people, the first thing people want to go to is the Affordable Care Act. Turns out, really hard to make that argument in a data-based way. That is, the data does not really strongly support, really doesn't support much at all, the notion that this has to do with disincentives to hire full-time workers because of the Affordable Care Act. By the way, the reason we sort of can kind of get a handle on that is because part-time defined in the unemployment statistics is 35 hours or less. Part-time defined by the Affordable Care Act is 30 hours or less. So you can actually look at people who were part-time in the unemployment statistics, working 30 to 34 hours, before the Affordable Care Act. So they were already sort of part-time in our official way of thinking about it, and then ask whether after the Affordable Care Act did they get shifted to below 30 hours, which would be an easy adjustment for the most part in a part-time workforce. Didn't happen. Now, we don't know if it didn't happen because we just didn't have enough time. Actually, the evidence from Massachusetts is that there was some effect from the Romney Care sort of legislation, and it took a long time for that adjustment to show up in the data. But my suspicion is there's something to this that is structural, but it has to do with something maybe we don't have a very good notion or a very good explanation for. So if you thought I was going to give you answers to anything, people who know me know that you weren't going to get answers. You're just going to get more questions and the things that hurt our heads. So here's the second thing I said I was going to look at. Why is the unemployment rate flattening out? Well, mechanically, it's a pretty simple explanation. The labor force participation rate has flattened out. So labor force participation rate, the fraction of people in the population who are actually in the official labor force. When I say that it takes 85,000 jobs a month to keep the unemployment rate from changing, that's predicated on a guess about what the structural rate of participation is in the economy. And our best estimates, everybody's estimates, is that the labor force participation rate going through time is going to fall. And the reason it's going to fall is because, you know, there's a whole bunch of people about my age who are getting really tired and are ready to go fishing. And as the baby boom generation kind of rolls through, that group gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They're not being replaced by younger people. So the structural participation rate is falling. That picture should be going south. It's not going south. It's going sideways. So something's going on there that is different than what we think will go on in the long run. And the higher is the labor force participation rate, that just means more jobs you have to create to get people from being unemployed. So right now, 150, 60, 70,000 jobs a month looks like just enough to get those people into the labor force that want to be in the labor force. Now, there's a narrative that grew up around this sideways behavior. Why are we experiencing participation in labor force which is bigger than what we expect? And that narrative is, again, I'm putting on my monetary policymaker hat, that narrative is there's actually this shadow pool of labor out there. People who are not counted in any official statistic, who actually are just sort of out there saying they don't want a job or haven't even looked for a job in the last 12 months or any of that. And that as the economy continues to improve and the pace of job creation continues to look healthy, they start to get optimistic. They come in off of the sidelines. That's a story that says all these official statistics are entirely misleading about how well we can do if we just push a little harder. That was my, so this is the second one. That was my story before I started being told that was not a very good story by the data. So here's the data. So here's the question. If we got a strong enough pull, that is, if we push hard enough on the economy, can we kind of draw people into the labor force, as appears to be happening, and realize a potential that is very much greater than what you would see in any sort of official statistic related to labor force underutilization or labor underutilization? Well, here's the tricky thing. When we talk about net, additions to the labor force, we're talking about net additions. So in any given month, there's a flow of people coming in off of the sidelines into the labor force, and there's a flow of people who are in the labor force leaving out, like all the retiring baby boomers. So the story I just told you is that there's a bunch of people who are out who all of a sudden, because we are wise, omniscient, omnipotent, benevolent policymakers, are being sucked into the labor force just by the good times that have not yet gone away. That's the story I told you about. That's the shadow labor force story. Beautiful story, but a wrong one. And here's why it's wrong. So here's these two flows I told you. Here's what they look like. So the red line is the shadow labor force story. It's the probability of a non-participant, someone who's out of the labor force, transitioning into the labor force. And the period of time you want to look at is 2014 to 2020 through 2016 here at the very end. That probability is just like that part-time transition to full-time, that probability is falling. It's not increasing. What's happening is the blue line, actually, at least over the last couple of years. That's the probability of people who are in the labor force not leaving. So this is a story of people who normally would have left the labor force not leaving. Turns out these are disproportionately the long-term unemployed. People who are have been unemployed for longer than 27 weeks. They are not exiting the labor force at, let me get this right, they're not exiting labor force at the rate that historically they would have. What does that mean? I don't have a clue what that means. These aren't people on unemployment. They're out 27 weeks, so this is not a public benefit to being officially called unemployed. It's something else. Maybe it's optimism. Maybe it's optimism that is not manifesting itself in pulling people off of the sidelines, but from keeping people to go to the sidelines. And that's a more reasonable story about these non-participants versus participants, and we know that because we can look at another piece of evidence. I recognize that position. So often when we kind of think about this issue of labor force participation, what we try to look, we know what's happening with young people. Young people, apropos to the discussion of this get-together, are staying out of the labor force longer, in part because they are staying in education longer in greater degree. So, we're not going to worry too much about that. By the way, some of them are just kind of hanging out, too, quite frankly. So we had a conference not very long ago and had a paper in it by a guy from Chicago and New York. And basically, they were looking at the really dramatic decline in the labor force participation rate of young males. Their explanation: better and cheaper video games and computers. So you have look, why do people go to work? Because they want stuff. If stuff gets cheaper, they have less of a reason to go to work. And so they were correlating it with the fact that you can get there's a lot more fun to be had for a lot less money. Plus, they're living in their parents' basements. And by the way, the other part of this was they went to survey data about the level of happiness. These guys are ecstatic. So they do these scales, they have these faces on them that are like the pain scales in an office with a big smiley face, or I can't barely stand to take another step. And so they're called something ladders. I forget exactly what they are. But so these young guys, they're not going to work because they got really good opportunities for relatively cheap to do stuff they like to do. They're happy as can be. You know who's unhappy? Yeah, their parents. You didn't really need science to tell you that, I don't think. But so we kind of get rid of those people. We kind of get rid of the people who are my age because we know that retirement's coming. We know it's a bigger group. We expect their labor force participation to fall. So you generally look at these people in the age group between about 24 and 55. That's the prime age group. And the thing that people have pointed out quite a lot is that the labor force participation rate of these guys has been falling quite dramatically well, and that's a symptom of a labor market that's not functioning quite well. Well, here's a problem with that story. First of all, this has been happening forever. This is the prime age male participation rate going back to 1948. If you see much that's different in the most recent episode from what you could have seen in other episodes over the past 50 years, I don't see it. Furthermore, we know kind of something about the people who are out of the labor force in this age group, and this comes from a Boston Fed conference from a paper by Alan Krueger. Many of you probably know who Alan Krueger is, who went to survey data. And here's the fundamental question he's asking. If you look at prime age males, are they structurally different with the people who are out of the labor market versus the ones who are in? And remember, in means both unemployed and employed. And he
makes the case in this paper that the answer is, yeah, they're structurally different. And here's what I'm going to show you. Here's the answer to the question of what kind of health are you in. So he takes the percentage of people males, prime-age males, who answer the question, I'm in poor health or I'm only in fair health. And if you look at employed people, about 12% say they're not very healthy. If you look at unemployed people, not much bigger percentage says, yeah, I'm not very healthy. If you look at those who are out of the labor force, who are non-participants, it's 43%. This is a different population than the people who have chosen to be in. Now, we don't know the causality. We don't know if it's because just basically they're unhealthy and therefore that's an impediment to being in the labor force, or if there's something in their way of being a productive member of the labor force that is making them feel or acting in ways that make them unhealthy. Don't know. But they are different. And it probably means there's going to be a different set of policies that are going to be required if this is a social problem. And there's a recent book called Men Without Work that many of you may be aware of that suggests that this is a huge social problem. We need these guys in the labor force. Yeah.
Is there any research to tell whether any of those reporting bad health are actually on disability?
Yeah, there is. So in Kruger's paper, he does break down sort of what their problems are, how debilitating it is. I think whether or not they're literally on disability, but a bunch of them obviously will be. So it is a pretty, it does have some detail in it underneath it that's really quite interesting. We do know if people says that if somebody goes into disability, the probabilities of coming off are pretty small. We also know that the people who are formally on disability are concentrated in the age groups of about 50 to 60, which kind of makes sense, because that's when you've sort of given up, is basically the issue. Yeah.
Did they bifurcate this between physically poor health or mentally poor health?
It is both. It is both.
Is the statistics basically the same from the top to the bottom, or does it change?
It's not. That is not disproportionately mental health.
Because I just don't feel like working on it.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, so you never know how people are answering these things, but again, it's like, you can look at the percentages, and I don't have them off the top of my mind about how many say I'm physically unable to work, I have no mobility, I don't have the dexterity, you can look at a bunch of different categories to try to figure out sort of, how severe the ailment seems to be. The broader point was really just, look, these people are classifying themselves as different, and they're different than the people that are in, and that's a different challenge. It would be one thing if these populations otherwise looked exactly the same, then some sort of blanket approach to stimulating aggregate demand and getting, kind of making sure the job market is hot would work. It's not so obvious it works in this case. Now, part of it is probably just a reflection of what we know, which is people are unhappy, and unhappiness yields to poor health in circumstances where they view, at least, their job prospects as bad. So again, the causality needs to be examined, closely. Here's another one that I think we ought to pay more attention to, and on the structural side of things, which is, are we providing the right sense? So we just had an election. It was kind of an interesting one. When we were talking that, now everybody is sort of rethinking about what the policy mix is going to be going forward. One of the clear sort of agenda items that will at least be discussed, I don't know if it will happen, is tax reform. And I'm here to say in my next set of slides here is that this tax reform issue, as it relates to the things we're discussing today, really ought to be thought about very carefully in ways that I don't hear anybody talking about in the political realm. So here's what I mean by this. So I'm going to refer to, I told you this would be researchy. I'm going to refer to this paper by these guys, Alan Auerbach, Larry Kotlikoff, and Daryl Kaler. You may have heard of a couple of those. Larry actually ran for president. He didn't win, apparently. And it was pretty quixotic run for the presidency. But they're two well-known economists. And they said, let's think about tax policy. But let's think about tax policy in the way that we ought to think about tax policy as it relates to every single individual in this country. Don't just think about the corporate income tax. Don't just think about the income tax. Think about the relationship that individuals have with the government in terms of the difference between what they hand over to the government and what the government gives back. So they're going to define taxes very inclusively to include everything you give the government: sales taxes, local taxes, state income taxes, federal income taxes, Social Security taxes, Medicare payments, all that stuff. Less negative taxes, the stuff the government gives back to you: Social Security benefits, Medicare benefits, welfare payments, all sorts of stuff. So we should think about taxation in this broad sense, and let me show you why. You have to think about taxation in that broad sense if you want to think about tax reform as it relates to human capital development, human capital opportunities. So here's one look at the data. This is just average tax rates by wealth quintile. So wealth quintile here is defined actually this is a great paper. I mean, it really is. I mean, and if you got the patience, you should look at it. Because they're defining wealth in the way really an economist would define wealth, which is it's just not only what you've accumulated to date, but the present value of what your labor will yield you over the expected remaining period of your lifetime. So that obviously depends on what age you are. So they're looking at people aged 40 to 49. And then they're just calculating their average tax rates. Take all those things I showed you on the previous slide. What's the net payment to the government for each of these wealth quintiles relative to the level of their wealth? And if you take this look at it, our tax system looks quite progressive. So the average net tax rate paid by the poorest of our population is minus 26%. Which basically means you're getting more in benefits than you're paying out over your lifetime. This isn't over the lifetime. This is in a current year. And as people get wealthier and wealthier, move up the wealth quintiles, you pay more. So that the top average tax rate on average is about 37%. And I think most of us will look at that and say that seems like a well-ordered, progressive tax system. You might argue with the numbers, but the poorest are getting subsidies. The wealthiest are paying the highest freight. Except this is exactly the wrong way to think about taxation in a human capital context. Because the right question is on average what you get. The title of this paper is Inequality, Progressivity, and Work Disincentives. The question is, if I earn one more dollar, how much do I get to keep? What's the marginal tax rate? If I get up off the couch, put down my video game, and go to work, what's the net benefit to me? That looks a lot different. Well, that's just over the lifetime. Here's the marginal tax rates. Again, poorest to the wealthiest. There's no progressivity there at all. The marginal tax rate for the poorest of our citizens for earning one more dollar is 33%. For the richest, it's 38%. This isn't a progressive system at all. And it's much worse than that. Because the other thing these guys do is because they're doing this at an individual level. They're going into individual records. They got, they got data on individuals, and they can say, I can look at what the dispersion within these quintiles looks like. So they can say, what's the lowest tax rate that somebody pays, and what's the highest tax rate that somebody pays? So let's look at the lowest and second quintiles. Take a look at that. The minimum amount for someone in the lowest wealth quintile is a subsidy, minus 22%. Look at the highest. 935%. Meaning for the honor of earning $1, you get to pay the government $9. Are those people ever going to work? Ever? If you provide them a really hot economy, are they going to work? If you provide them a great education, are they going to work? Somebody I presented this not too long ago, and somebody said to me, this is an IQ test. If you're at the other end of that thing and you're going to work, you have very strange preferences because you're going to pay the government $9 for doing it. And this isn't any fancy calculation about I got to think about the full path of benefits I'm going to get and all that sort of stuff over time. This is just all we require of people is that they can do a calculation about how much they're going to give up if they go take the initiative to earn $1. So I have a contention, which is I'm stepping a little bit out of my portfolio, but my contention is if we talk about tax reform in this country and don't recognize this and think about this, what good are we going to do? This is a supply-siders argument. This ain't no bleeding heart stuff. This is kind of cold, hard facts about what people at the bottom of the scale, the bottom of the ladder, what they're facing. Not a single person in this room would go to work facing these types of tax rates. Not a single one of us, unless we were forced to by law.
David, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just so I understand. You would, if your job opportunity was such that you would move from the lowest quintile to the third quintile, because at that point in time you were paying yourself, right? So
Yeah, but you would have to think about how big would that income jump have to be.
I got it, but there's math that says if you can get educated, you can get to a place where you can earn, I don't know what your crossover income is, but there's a crossover income that says at that point in time I'm better advantaged if I can get to that quartile as opposed to hanging around in the lower quartile.
There is, and I've seen calculations in the past, and I won't vouch for them, but calculations that would put that number at something like $60,000.
So if you take a job, if you can get yourself educated and drive a truck, average salary $85,000.
Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect argument for not going to work, but going to build human capital separately.
Exactly. So I'm not suggesting you shouldn't play with the tax rates because that would be incredibly easy to do. For sure, I'm just suggesting it's going to have to also require something else. You're going to have to get help. You're going to get those people out of that because playing with that, you and I will both be retired multiple years more before that is actually policy that can be done in Washington, and you and I both know that.
Exactly. And the only thing I would say about that is when you think about what those opportunities are, you better have this in mind.
Because you got to have a number you have to get to.
Yeah.
You kind of got to solve for a number that you have to get to.
That's right.
More
Look, it's not so bad for everyone else. I mean, it really is the lowest 40% that we're talking about. First of all, they're really not so clear there should be any dispersion at all, so that's a problem in and of itself. But you can see the people this is impacting. One last thing, very quickly, and this now will kind of go back into my portfolio. Do we think, actually, that, despite, so I've already kind of given you if you're keeping score, some reasons to be skeptical about the capacity to have monetary policy do a whole bunch more. Because I'm kind of identifying all this sort of stuff that looks structural. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't ask the question. We should ask the question is if we're willing to take the heat on our back ends a little bit, can we improve something? And it's not a bad question because there's some reason to believe that possibly we can. So here's a picture you all know. This is Black, Hispanic, white unemployment. And what's very clear, of course, is that the Black unemployment rate is higher by a lot than the white unemployment rate, and even Hispanic unemployment rates are quite a lot higher than white unemployment rates. Here's another fact. If we look at periods of time, which I've identified here, that we might identify as high-pressure economies, so I'm borrowing some language, I think, from Chair Yellen in a speech. By the way, the views that I express are my own and not those of the Federal Reserve. So I'm not trying to say this is what she had in mind, but here's something you could have in mind. And here's just what I have in mind. We have some notion, and I'm taking this notion from the Congressional Budget Office, of what the natural rate of unemployment is, or what the kind of equilibrium rate of unemployment is. And I can identify periods of time when the unemployment rate fell below what the CBO says is really sort of what the economy can sustain over long periods of time. So I've identified those periods going back to the 1970s. And what this is, that label is somewhat wrong, it's the change in the gap between African American unemployment and white unemployment. So I kind of was led to think about this because at the annual big Jackson Hole conference that all the swells in central banking go to out in Wyoming every August, this year they had a meeting beforehand with the Fed Up group, a dialogue, and they said, look, you guys should be willing to push a little harder. You should be willing to take a risk on a little more inflation maybe, for example, to try to pull along the people who are falling behind. And sure enough, if you look at these periods of time, the people who have fallen behind disproportionately gain. The gap between black and white unemployment rates closes some in these periods of time when the economy overheats, if you will. Now here's kind of the problem with that. Here I've just identified those high pressure periods. That's the red stuff. And I've superimposed it over a bunch of gray bars. Those gray bars, they're recessions. So what do you kind of notice in this picture? You kind of notice that every overheating period ends with a gray bar, a recession. And here's the other thing. Here's how that black-white unemployment differential behaves over the entire cycles. And if you look at what happens to the gap between black and white unemployment rates during shaded bar periods, it's the African American population that gets hit. So we can close the gap by overheating the economy, but they tend to end in recessions, and recessions make life worse for exactly the populations we'd be trying to favor. Now, there's an interesting question here. Do you get a gray bar because the Fed freaks out and says, oh my goodness, the economy's overheating, we got to do something about it. We take away the punch bowl, and we more particularly take it away from certain people. Or is there just something that's not sustainable about these overheating periods? And this is the struggle for us at the moment. This is the question we're trying to ask. Now, after the recessions, these differentials come down. So if you looked at okay, let's look at an overheating period. Let's look 5 years down the road after it ends. Did the people who were pulled into the labor force did they tend to gain persistently or permanently? We don't know the answer to that. It's hard to identify. That's the things we're thinking about as we speak. What is our responsibility to these problems that look structural? How structural are they? And does monetary policy itself interact in some way with those structural problems? Most of the stuff I showed you before, not so clear. This one is a little murkier to us. So just to set up your next conversation, this, of course, is by education, unemployment rates by education. So there's a couple pretty interesting messages here. One is that, well, obviously, the unemployment rates tend to decline as the population becomes more educated. Not so much at the lowest level, but certainly as you go down into to higher levels of education. The other thing is if you break it down by race, it almost doesn't matter what educational group you're into. If you're Hispanic or you're black, your probability of being unemployed is higher for the same education level. Seems like something worth thinking about. So that's what it is. The smallest African American to white unemployment gaps are those with bachelor's degrees, but it's still 50% higher, which means there's other forces at play that have to be thought of in terms of their interaction with the educational system if we're going to get our full hands on that. So there's a couple questions for you to think about and answer. I didn't have to tell you what questions you had to think about and answer, but Stuart gave me that slide, so so I put it up there. So let me stop, and if you have any residual questions you'd like to ask, I'd be glad to entertain them. Yeah.
David, thanks for the commentary. One thing you didn't touch on, which I think companies are getting concerned about, is the gig economy and digital labor and robotics and the impact on unemployment there. Can you give a quick synopsis of your views on that?
Yeah, so there's, did everyone hear the question? So gig economy and technology replacement for labor. About the gig economy, I'll say it's really too small at this point to have much of a substantial impact on labor markets, and it's not clear how persistently it would. I mean, all you have to do is think about Uber, which is sort of the flower child of the gig economy stuff, and already they're trying to figure out how to get rid of those drivers. So driverless cars are going to put all the Uber drivers out of business sooner or later. In fact, already there are driverless Uber services in Pittsburgh, I guess. The technology thing is a lot trickier. Here's what we know. We know, and look, and this is, the consequences of this were showed up in the election for sure. The labor markets in the United States, and in fact the entire world, advanced economy world, fundamentally changed around about 2000. I mean, you can just see it in the data. Just everything changes. And those changes are related to two things, globalization and technology, and those things are not disconnected. The main impact that that's had is that it has, and many of you probably know this work, I'm kind of quoting the work of David Autor, who's the most sort of famous scholar talking about these issues. What it's done is it basically hollowed out the middle, that was the hollowing out of the middle class jobs bit. So you see all the job growth at the low skill end, the high skill end, and what's happened is all those people who used to be able to walk out of high school and command a middle class living, that all went away. So technically it's, anything that can be automated will be. So all those jobs that involve routine tasks, whether they're high skilled or low skilled, they tend to be disproportionately middle skilled, all that stuff, gone. Things that require thinking, not gone. And by thinking, I mean like making a bed, in a hotel room. It includes that sort of stuff, because actually that's a pretty complex task. It's really kind of hard to automate cleaning up whatever mess I made in a hotel room. And I know, because I'm, you know, the housekeepers usually come running after me going, what the hell are you doing in there? So that's why you get sort of this low skill, high skill, because non-routine cognitive tasks of some sort are being rewarded in the market now. And we have not figured out now how to, for example, so I say, kind of this, the example I use often is this, you know, post-World War II generation. You know, the finest thing that ever happened to development in the United States was the emergence and development of the public school system. Because the public school system became optimized to providing people after 12 years the capacity to go out and do something that was valued in the economy that existed. What we need to do is figure out what the analog to that public school system is in an environment that is now completely different and changing very rapidly. So it's, you know, it's not an unrelentingly negative picture, but it's a picture that basically has cut out an entire middle portion of the country, people who are capable, skilled, don't need remedial kind of training or or not making up for something failed down the road. It's just people who have not, for whatever reason, had access to sort of educational system, workforce development system, whatever it is, that would, you know, address this changing reality. And it's a reality now, like I said, we're a decade and a half into. It wasn't the recession. It was underway well before the recession. One answer, I guess, is to close down your borders, get rid of globalization, and take away computers. I'm going to guess that's not the solution we want. So then the solution is what you're going to talk about next. So thank you very
Round
much.
of applause for David, please. Thank you. Okay, for our panel members, please come on up and grab your seat. I'll give you quickly just names and faces so you can put those together. Stu Andresen with the Federal Reserve Bank here will be our moderator. And Stu is going to go through this pretty quickly, a couple of questions, and then turn to Q&A to the last few minutes so you can still have a chance to do that. Just for names and faces, this is Ken Zeth, Carol Lewis, and David Scheibel. Stu, it's yours.
Thank you all for being here, and I actually want to end with, or start where Dave ended. We've got some questions that I think are going to be really relevant, and so we'll talk about some of them, but I want to say that, you know, I think the stage that we've set is one that talks about a complex entanglement of trends in the economy, tax policy, social issues, and educational policies that help support this change. I want to get your reflections on that, and after we talk for a little bit, I want to talk about what each of you all think, because I think that you all are going to bring very different perspectives that are going to add a lot of value to the question that Dave posed, which is what if in the post-World War II era, the development of the public school system was one of the greatest roles of developing our economy and growing our economy, what are the few things that are going to be a vision for what we need to do today going forward? But first, I really want to start with you, David. You're from the Midwest, you're in Atlanta, you're all over the country, involved in the business community deeply. The question that I want to ask is what do you see happening with the American dream? However you define that. Is it intact? And what role can education play?
Yeah, well, one thing you know as a panelist, you never follow an animal trick, a child's play, or an economist. That's that's a bad plan. What I will say is the American dream clearly is alive. Look, this is still the best economy and the best place in the world, right? We've got rule of law. We've got significant access to capital. The feds make sure it's very cheap. We have a reserve currency, lots of innovation. So there's lots of investment going on. The United States says this is the right place to be for long-term opportunity. No question about that. Used to be that there were three ways to make money. You either made money with your back, you made money with your head, or you made money with money. So those of you who are independently wealthy, I'm not talking to you. But the other two still are part of it, but it's not the same. When we grew up, as David said, you could come out of high school and you literally could go and work in a large manufacturing facility and make $60,000 a year. And so you'd be in his second quintile very quickly. Those jobs are more difficult, even in manufacturing that has not been hollowed out. So we don't do much coal mining anymore, and we don't do much steel manufacturing, appliance manufacturing. We still do a lot of manufacturing in the United States, but those jobs are more technical. You have to be able to operate equipment that's more sophisticated. Your math skills have to be better. Your linguistic skills have to be better. And when 40% of people 25 and over are at best high school educated, even those jobs go wanting. So there's great opportunity, but you have to prepare yourself differently today than my parents did, and in some cases, my generation did. More preparation, more complex jobs, and you have to be in a position to take advantage of those jobs, or you're going to see his tax policy issues play out.
Ken, I want to follow on that. What's happening in public education? We've always seen it as one of the big drivers of opportunity and mobility. David talked earlier about that ability. Here we go. I felt like it was pretty close to my face, but.
So much more authoritative now.
All right, and I'll talk a little louder too. So we've thought that education's a primary driver. We know that I think that where we ended is that it's not necessarily the whole story about what's going on. But what's the public education system doing now? Is it adequately filling its role as an institution that helps to create mobility? So this is a yes or no question. I want to hear a little bit more than yes or no. And tell us a little bit about what are some efforts going on and maybe what you're doing.
Thanks, Stuart. And also, I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this conversation. I think this is, if anything, that you leave today with that slide that shows that there are two slides that really jumped out at me. One is that how important education is to unemployment, that as you move, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, education is the prime number. We all kind of knew that in our hearts, that if you solve for education, you solve for welfare, you solve for healthcare, you solve for crime, you solve for poverty. It's nice to see the data bear that out, something that we all know to be true. The other piece that I think is quite fascinating is in order to bridge that gap between blacks and Hispanics and whites in the job market, we need to overheat the economy and basically drive ourselves into recession, which is not a terribly sustainable path, right? And so that kind of gives us pause, that's the only thing that's been working, is to put us in that difficult position. We know the system isn't getting the types of results that we want. We know that kids are consistently being left behind. If you look at it at a local level, all of this tells you that we need to do something. We need to do something big. We need an equity agenda. That this is not going to be enough to drive this from economic policy from afar. We need local initiatives. We need a local will to help bridge this gap. In Fulton County, we saw it at some of our lowest performing schools, that if you look at those schools, you need to do something different. You need to bring in high quality talent. You need to have wraparound services that Carol talked about. You need to do things that you can't just, that are different for those environments, because those kids are coming in with less. And so if we want to make a difference, we have to do something around equity. Now, I'll just say at the regional basis, if you look at the data across the regions, what Learn for Life spends a lot of time thinking about, we are, as a region, we are underperforming. We are leaving too many kids behind. And so if we're going to find, the good news is there are things that are working, and we have to find those things. Because if you look at the data across the region for the percentage of kids that are reading on grade level, it's 40%. 40% of the kids in the metro area, of the 600,000 kids that serve the metro area, are reading at grade level. That's astonishing. And then if you disaggregate that data and you look at African American kids, low income kids, you start getting the low 20s, high teens. How are we going to turn those? How are we going to flip that chart? If kids can't read, how are they going to forget about the skills that David was talking about to really be a big thinker, to turn around a labor market? If you're not reading at grade level in third grade, your chance of being successful are greatly diminished. So the only way to do that is concentrated strategies around equity. So the answer to your question is the public education system is working for some. It's not working for enough. And the only way it's going to change is if we really embrace that data and really develop an equity agenda around it.
Great. So, Carol, kind of to follow on that, there's been a lot of changes happening in education policy and education legislation over the last few years. I'm looking at my notes because we all call it ESSA, and maybe in this room that's okay to say. But it is the Elementary and Secondary School Act, which funds the education system, has recently been reauthorized. There's a lot of state and local activity in terms of developing new state plans. Are there things that you're hopeful for, that you think are going to help drive potentially some of this equity agenda? And what are the ways that you think communities broadly and through communities and schools can get involved in helping to drive some of that?
And thank you for having the opportunity to talk about something I've always been extremely passionate about. But the Every Student Succeeds Act is the first time in 15 years that we've really taken a hard look at that, what funds Title I and reauthorize it. What I'm hopeful about, particularly because when I think about equity issues and driving our students toward careers, is that we really need to take a different approach. We need to think about the students coming out of our communities. They walk into our schools with whatever issues that they're managing from their homes, from their communities. They're bringing it out to the school. The teacher is facing 30 students with very different issues, and sometimes issues that prevent them from being ready to learn. So when we look at the reauthorization of the ESSA, and we look at the Reauthorization Act, what some of the strengths of it is that it allows flexibility. It allows the flexibility at the district level, at the state level, then at the district level, and being able to keep that flexibility so it addresses those issues that our children are facing, and also that our schools are facing. What I would love, I guess, as we think about building the plan, is making a commitment to long-term investments in those low-performing schools. Not that it's a 3-year and we're done. It's let's work on this and continue to improve, because once the money's there and you now you've invested in your teachers, you've invested in a structure, you have to be able to maintain that structure, because most of our children have brothers and sisters. They're coming out of communities that the community is going to change much slower than our schools. And I think if we have this opportunity to also look at wraparound services, and this is something that communities and schools have worked on very diligently, is to be able to now authorize within the legislation that you can now use those Title I dollars to support those integrated student support services, those wraparound services for students, so they're ready to sit in a seat and learn. You're having to help them. I always think about it. My favorite movie is A Christmas Carol, and one of the things you build that chain that around the neck, and you carry that chain forever. Our children are building chains. They're coming in the classrooms with if there are hunger issues, if there are issues at home, if there's a drug issue coming from the streets, if they're feeling bullied, all of those things they're bringing to the classroom. So the integrated student supports, having someone who's done an assessment of the school, done an assessment of the community to see what the strengths are in the community, and being able to bring that into the classroom, and to help that teacher help that student, and help that student be ready to learn.
I want to come back to that in just a minute, but.
Well, it's interesting because Carol's right. The problem with education is like trying to take a bite of the elephant, right? And so, once the student is in the system, then you've got to do remediation to get them. But there's a lot of data that says if you don't get early childhood education, if we don't get the kids pre-K into this, then their chances of catching them up in the 3rd grade, you put a heck of a burden on the teachers that say, I'm going to give you this child which speaks 1/3 as many words as other students, and you need to get them all reading by the 3rd grade. That is an incredible, and then we pass them on to high school and they say, oh, by the way, less than 80%, 20% of them are actually proficient in 5th grade math. Well, there's a winning proposition. So when they come out, they're not ready. What happens then is corporations like ours, when we hire these people, there's only 2 things you really have to do. One, you have to pass the drug test. You laugh, but that's a big deal. And then the second part is you have to be able to have enough capability to run the equipment. But we're doing remedial work within the company. So companies are now putting dollars to train these kids that are coming out of schools. And so if we don't get them early enough in the system, you're just not going to, you're going to hearken back to, well, I'm not going to get that job, so therefore I'm going to go to the job that provides a benefit. And that's the vicious cycle that we're trying to work through. So the wraparound services in many ways are more important than some of the things that actually happen within the 4 walls of the school, because our teachers are good. You have to give them something they can work with. And in many of the cases in areas like Atlanta, we do not do that. As a community, we don't give them something they can work with.
Carol, talk a little bit about, so we've got this problem. We've got people, and we've got students coming in with chains on their neck. We've got students that are coming in behind, and we know that their opportunities to advance are greatly diminished. We need to keep them in school to help them catch up. Talk a little bit about the CIS model and how communities can support really the individual needs of students that are behind and need additional support and of all types.
As I said, when we look at integrated student services and support services, it is taking the assessment of the school. What are the issues that are the prevailing issues of that school? What are the prevailing issues within that community? And then also, what's the prevailing issues of that for that student? Then you also take a look at what are the assets within the community, because sometimes we think about, well, you're in high poverty schools. There's really no benefit. You have to bring in everything from outside. That's not necessarily true. You really have. I've not met a parent to date. Well, not very few parents who do not want the absolute best for their student. But they don't necessarily know how to do that. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at how do you build on the assets of a community and find them. You may have to look hard to find them. But you build a plan for that school. There's an academic plan, but then there also should be a social structural plan, and they should complement each other. What we do is put a person inside the building right now, being able to offer support for the entire school based on those those things that are found that affect every student in that school. And then that individual student, a support plan for that individual student. There's somebody in that building right now. We also know that we don't have enough social workers, nor do we have enough counselors in our schools to address the issues that they need. And nor can they be critically involved in the various issues. I'm talking from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. You just can't say, well, we're going to fix them if they're reading really well, but then they have a teen pregnancy issue in middle school. That's an issue that has to be, when it happens, you have to have a response or a prevention strategy in the beginning. Because I think it's great to put, we talk about educational rigor, we talk about, all of these things we want to put in front of the kids inside the building, but they're coming inside the building, they're going out of the building. They're bringing things into the building with them. And we also have to professionalize help our teachers. I think one of the things we beat them down. We now have probably the lowest enrollment of teachers in our schools, but they're facing a lot. They're facing the kids without any support, without any help, and that's what CIS does. It helps that teacher eliminate those issues that they have to deal with, because if Johnny's acting out because they're having dental problems or can't see, no matter what structure you put in place inside that classroom, it's not going to eliminate that problem. And so that's why we're there, to help the teacher, help the school, and be a partner, and bringing those resources, vetting the resources that are in the community before you bring them in the school. So that's also even a help to the principals. So that's something else they don't have to do. We take that off the plate. And then we're also collecting the data. Does this work? Everything we do is research-based. to be able to put it in and know it works, and know that you'll get the positive results.
I just want to build on that, because what Carol's described, and you know, we've all been in rooms like this where we hear great programs and think, gee, why it's a good idea. Why aren't we doing more of that? Like, let's do that. And this is what the good news, so this is back to your question of, is there good news, is there a bad news story? And the good news is, there's great stuff happening like communities and schools throughout the metro area. There are great programs at all levels, and as Dave talked about in preschool, there's great programs in preschool, there's great programs in middle school, there's great programs in high school. But we have this environment where we're so program rich, but kind of systems poor. Like it doesn't all hang together. And it's like talking about a business and saying, well, I got this one division that's doing a really good job, but how's the company? Well, let me tell you about this one division that's doing really well, because that's what we want to talk about today. And then next year we'll talk about something different. We'll talk about another division, another market we just opened up in emerging markets. Yeah, the core business, we're not talking about that. This is where we need to move as a region, and we're starting to do this with transportation. We're starting to think regionally about transportation. We kind of woke up, you know, there's a lot of mixed messages from the election last week, but one thing that I think we all sort of agree to is that we need to, you know, transportation is a regional issue. You can't just say here that, you know, I'm just going to live in Sandy Springs, and the rest of the country, you know, you all figure it out. We're going to nail it in Sandy Springs. That's a short-term answer, and we've woken up to that. I think the same thing is true with education. These boundaries that we draw between where Cobb ends and where Fulton begins and where DeKalb starts, those are conversations that don't mean a lot to families. They don't mean a lot to employees. They certainly don't mean much to business. It's not how the world works. And so what I get excited about in the region is the opportunity to kind of find those bright spots that are happening and then report on those to the community. And then, you know what, if Communities and Schools is working here, you know, you are doing great work in South Fulton, great work in Atlanta, why aren't we doing that across the region? And what are we doing that we're spending money on and time and energy on that's not showing the results, that doesn't have the research bases, that doesn't have the outcomes that we can track year after year after year? If we don't start thinking about this stuff regionally, we're going to get stuck in this perpetual cycle of, you know, I think about it as archaeological layers of programs that, like, we just kind of wake up one morning and say, you know, we need to do something to teach girls how to code. I'm going to start something. Never mind that there's 3 programs that are doing that right now, and some of them are having success and some aren't. I'm just going to start something new. If you feel like starting a new program in Metro Atlanta, I would ask you to take a deep breath. Crack open the computer, and you're going to find programs that are working, and get behind those, make those programs better, bring your intellectual capital or whatever resources you have to those programs, and then let's start having a regional conversation about how we can move forward as a region, because that's the only thing that's going to break. Our businesses, our parents, our students demand regional solutions to these complex problems.
And make no mistake, it is a competition. Atlanta is competing with Charlotte, with Dallas, with Chicago. We are competing. And when areas like Cincinnati are ahead of us in their collective approach to education, and you see the progress in communities like that, and you realize that we're not keeping up, you got to step back and say, really? Cincinnati is like an airport hub of Atlanta, and they're beating us in this process. So you know, if we want to continue to draw the right kind of jobs to Atlanta, we want to continue to draw the right kind of, the right kind of resources. We have to be able to invest, just like transportation, in education, or corporations will make different decisions about where they put their headquarters, where they put their new locations, where they put their new distribution centers. They'll make it, if they can't find the workers to run those facilities or do the data mining that's required, they will go where they are. So it is a competition. It is not an out-of-body experience. We need to be able to we need to be able to do this more effectively in the Atlanta area, or we won't like our future as far as a place that people want to come and live and work.
All right, we're going to turn to you all to give you all a chance to ask questions and make comments. We're going to have about 10, 12 minutes for that, and then we're going to turn back to and you can press them with hard questions. Give me easy ones. But then we're going to turn back, and rather than, I'm going to take this one step back from the question that Dave left us with, which was what are the big changes in public education that are going to make it the big driver of growth? What are the things that we want to see in 5 years from now in Metro Atlanta and the state of Georgia that says we have made significant improvements. We have helped the Georgia economy move forward, and we've supported businesses. So first off, questions from the audience. And we've got some mics running around, so that'll be your signal that you're good to go.
I guess that's my signal. I'm Polly McKinney. I'm the Advocacy Director at Voices for Georgia's Children. And we, along with the Georgia School-Based Health Alliance, work really hard on making sure people know about school-based health centers, comprehensive ones. And I haven't heard anybody talk about that. The wraparound is as close as we've gotten. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on expanding comprehensive school-based health beyond telehealth. But to the broader Georgia, we have about 22 comprehensive centers now in this state. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
I mean, I'll start. We built one in Wake Forest, elementary school, wonderful component for the community. It is a future. It is what communities need. It's a way to bring people in. It comes down to resources. It comes down to the collective will of the community to address, to allow that to happen. There's a lot of political issues in getting these things off the ground. I think you're going to see more and more of these in the future, and I think it improves, it improves attendance, it improves a parent's connection to the school. I just think we need to find if the data, we were still collecting the data in Fulton County. It was only a couple years old. It was encouraging. If the data is really there, I think that to me that's a part of a regional solution. It's one of these things that we're going to look back and say, well, of course, we look back now at convenience stores have minute clinics, of course, right? Why wouldn't that be the case? I think in a few years you're going to see the same thing in student-based healthcare.
I'm David Martin, Georgia Council on Economic Education. So I've heard Atlanta, I've heard the region. There's 181 school systems in Georgia. 101 of those school systems are defined as rural. They're not in metropolitan statistical areas. I think there's huge needs in those communities. What can we do to address that? And Carol, I know you're doing that in some of your work.
And I totally agree. Communities and schools, and just that same model of being able to address the issues with inside the school buildings and asset mapping of what's external, even in a rural community, and it's more impactful in many of our rural communities, is that looking at what are the needs. They are sometimes different, but also the resources are very different. So we found that for our organization, outside of the metro area, we're in 25 other communities, that you have to sometimes create the resources that don't exist. You have that shared resource sometimes in the metro area, competing resources. But if you're going to a Glasscock County, Communities and Schools is the nonprofit within that entire county. It is the feeding program, the backpack program, it's the school supply drive, it's a telehealth program. It is that conduit to bring those resources into the schools. So I think in many of our rural communities, it's also resource dependent. How do you now make that more efficient? By bringing collectively, and we always don't work really great together across county lines, is working together across county lines, building regional solutions, because there's limited dollars in the resource in the communities, but the investment is greatly needed in our students because they also don't move, and exposing them to different things. We found that many of our students, the first time they've ever been to Atlanta is because we brought them to Atlanta. Kids don't do field trips, as we've had conversations. So they're not exposed to opportunities to dream and to be and to do other things, and the potential to go to schools that aren't just right there in their communities, or take jobs that are beyond the things that they just see on a day-to-day. So the opportunity to expose children outside of the metro area, opportunity to expose kids within the metro area, because many of them also have never gone across county lines, is giving our children the opportunity to dream, because what we see, our kids see the illusion of wealth, they don't see the what it takes to work. And so many times that's what you're exposing them to, the possibilities and those opportunities.
Yeah, the businesses have actual role they can play in those as well, because most of there are a lot of manufacturing jobs in Georgia. Make no mistake about it. We make a lot of products in here that end up shipping globally. but they're not made in Atlanta. Nobody's putting manufacturing facilities in the center of Atlanta, traffic notwithstanding. So we have to hire from those regions. So what you're finding is companies like Southwire, where they're extending into the high schools the opportunity for these kids to find ways where they can connect into good jobs within the local community, so they get their skills with their high school work. And so you're seeing more and more business outreach differently than it used to be, which is you're in the community, they're going to come out, they're going to find us. Now it really is trying to reach into those schools and pull those kids into it. So you are seeing in the regional a little bit different approach that you really wouldn't work here in Atlanta necessarily, but certainly works regionally.
Hi, I'm Julia Bernath with the Fulton County Board of Education. I think that one of the challenges that we're seeing, many communities, even though they may look affluent, have need. And partnering with businesses, sometimes the challenge for school districts is getting the business community to agree to bring in students, to help mentor them, to provide those internships and mentorship programs, because it takes a lot more effort to teach somebody else to do something that you already know how to do. So how can we better partner with businesses to make them understand how critical it is to give students these experiences?
Thanks for the question, Julia. Full disclosure, Julia was my former boss at Fulton County Schools.
Well, this will be fun then.
So it's a very intelligent question.
Now you can say what you really want.
I would say that anyways.
Did you pay that?
And in a moment of honesty, though, I think school systems don't do a good job interfacing with businesses. We're not organized for it. There's there's very nascent offices that deal with businesses. They're very focused on the business of schooling. And so school districts don't do a good job meeting businesses where they are. Businesses are off doing their own thing and they don't know. Oftentimes we would get school district or businesses that would reach out to us and say, we'd love to have a volunteer day and paint your field house at one of your high schools. Which is great, except we got a bunch of painters that are professional, and when we've done things like that in the past, after your business volunteer day, we send our guys back in to actually do the job the right way, and so we don't really accomplish anything. It's that those authentic relationships have not manifested themselves. I think this is one of the exciting parts about a regional solution is that our large businesses across the metro area, they think regionally. They don't think about getting their name on the sign of a local high school football stadium. They want a large regional solution that matches their regional profile. So I think a regional solution is a way to go, because I do think if we leave it up to schools to one small elementary or one high school that's got all the complexities that it has to interface with a business, I think you're going to find that's what we've been doing, and what we find is that we get incomplete solutions for businesses and incomplete solutions for schools.
David, I want to get your perspective being on
Well,
the other
sometimes
side.
the outreach ends up being like, could you send me some money for X, Y, and Z, fill in the blank? And you can imagine in Atlanta, large corporations get a fair amount of requests we won't go through the list of checks that we write on that process, but that is not really helping us tremendously. It's the easiest thing for us to do is to write a check, but that really doesn't help you that much. So part of it is, and my mother was a teacher and my sister was a teacher, but we don't necessarily speak the same language. The communication, the language that we use in business is not exactly the same language, and sometimes there's not a translator. So that becomes very difficult for businesses to engage when the language is just not the same. And then you don't want us in there much often because we go, I tell you, here's 3 ways you could do that better. Continue Lean Sigma goes, if I were you, I reorganize the cafeterias. You guys going back anytime soon? Just send us the money. So that is a you laugh, but that is a failed experiment. So really one of the reasons that Sylvia and I and Dennis agreed with a fair amount of urging to support the Learn for Life was because we need to have a different way to engage with business that they can actually be positively impactful in the schools without bothering the teachers or just writing checks for backpacks and pencils and laptops. I mean, that's really not very satisfying.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to hear your 5-year vision. And we've got a mic in hand.
Good morning. My name is Brian Sikanshana. I'm the founder of Work Ready Grad, which is a STEM economic development tool for employers and a college and career readiness tool for students. And I have a question for the panel. For each of you, really. You were talking about how we should focus on regional impact, and your suggestion is to get behind the existing programs if you think you have things to contribute. So taking your suggestion to the regional level, which entities are your top 2 or 3 that are doing a good job of that you want us to encourage to research? And then related to that point, I guess to Carol, does CIS also look not only at individual schools for that assessment of needs versus assets, but do you do that at a regional level? And then to David, you mentioned Southwire, but is there an example of...
Only limited to 3.
This is the third and last question.
We have time for 3 more questions.
You mentioned Southwire, but do you have examples of industry coming together to be more involved as a unit? Because what I would be excited about would be if within this regional leadership, which I'm hoping y'all are going to help identify, they're looking at, you're able to find people who are pushing the employers to come together collectively to offer more internships, more apprenticeships, more whatever it may be, to encourage more of the students to get the right exposure and the right skill sets to be relevant to your workforce. So is anyone doing that?
Yeah, well, I'm going to take the easy one because now you work for me. So look, you know Junior Achievement is a great example. The Discovery, that is a great businesses that are competitors and suppliers come together and help and get kids introduced to what it's really like to be in the business, making your life decisions, the wraparound services that are providing this. So there's lots of examples here locally where they do that. Now, what you're not going to get is 3 competitors to come together and say, hey, let's all make it great. I mean, there's so many other reasons why that's not going to occur. But there are ways where I would say businesses have horizontal needs versus vertical. Because you run a corporation, you've got 2 needs. One is vertical, very, very specific to you, very, very specific to your products, your capabilities. There are horizontal needs, which are just really good things about analytics or math or logistics that you need horizontally. So businesses can work horizontally, not vertical. That's what JA does. You think about it, that's an example of where you can work horizontally and solve problems that every business has that are consistent across business. And that's where business can really work the best.
I'm trying to remember which question I'm going to answer, but the CIS, and that's really easy. Does CIS do a regional assessment? No. Do we do county based on the district? Yes. The districts, particularly if we're looking at a district or a high needs district, yes. And then rank those in priority order. Where we also try to interface are things like the Atlanta Regional Commission, interface with our chambers of commerce, interface with our RESAs that also exist, so that you're not necessarily having to go out and redo, but there's also a structure and a support system already there within those regions to be able to help answer the questions and also identify the needs where it takes place.
That's good.
I'll just conclude, first of all, very efficient use of questioning time, so congratulations. For Learn for Life, the collective impact model convenes folks around each of the key milestones in the cradle to career pipeline. So I'm not here to advocate for any specific programs yet. What we do is we bring a cross-functional group of folks together. They look at data, figure out what's working, and then build initiatives around that. So I would just say stay tuned as far as recommendations about specific programs.
All right, now you get to say your 5-year vision. What does Atlanta and Georgia look like in the education world?
So I would say personally, I'm very excited. We had a meeting last week, our first kind of superintendent strategy session, and we had the superintendents, the leadership of the big districts in the metro area come together, and to a person excited about working together with each other, and to a person saying we hadn't really done this in the past. We hadn't really shared information in the past. We haven't really talked about what's working because we have these centers of gravity. And so if we can continue to march forward around a key set of indicators that move kids forward, and we get everybody working together, then I'm pretty excited for the future. And knowing that the leadership of the school districts and the leadership of the community, of the Atlanta Regional Commission, the United Way, the Community Foundation, the Metro Chamber, those folks coming together and working on a collective initiative for education, that fills me with a sense of optimism.
Well, I don't think we'd achieve it in the next 3 to 5 years, but we're well on our way to a state without dropouts, and states where children are fully engaged. We also, we know that we have to address, I mean, bottom line, we have to address some of our equity issues. Poor rural schools need to have greater investments, and recognizing that there needs to be greater investments. But we also need to look at the whole child, that we're educating not just the academic side of a child, that we're looking at what are those wraparound support services that every child needs and deserves. What are those things, and making those available statewide, making those where children need them, but also prioritizing the greatest needs. So when I look at 3 to 5 years, I see CIS is everywhere. Would be wonderful and fully funded, and I'm just saying, it's Georgia Gives Day.
This is one of the programs you can get behind.
Shameless plug. Perfect plug. But just really beginning to I think it's extremely important that we talk to each other, but also bring in higher ed, that we're teaching teachers differently. We're teaching teachers to recognize what they need, taking teachers into industry so they're understanding what industry needs. So really doing our business differently, stepping away from just being in the classroom, just focusing on schools, but focusing on a whole community, whole state solutions.
Yeah, on a personal basis, the next 3 years, I hope to get my last child off the payroll, so that's number one.
Your basement.
Yeah, she did exactly what? She took a degree and did something that just didn't pan out. It was a low pay, and then she decided she wanted to do medical tech, so she go back to Emory. Unfortunately, none of those things transfer. None of her credits transfer. So she got 3 more years. It's great. I've lived all over the world. Atlanta is the best place I've ever lived. I like the opportunity here. It's going to continue to expand. What I want to see continually is that we educate more kids in Georgia and they stay in Georgia because the jobs and opportunities are here. The amount of kids that we lose through the secondary education here from Georgia Tech and UGA and Emory that do not stay in Georgia is a crime. When we finally get them educated, they leave. So we need to make sure we create the opportunities here so we keep that intellectual property here. They're high earners. They'll be able to invest back in the community. That's what I hope that we can do in the next 3 to 5 years.
Everyone, thank me and thank our panelists.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our panel. Stuart, thanks for moderating. David, great views on the role of the private sector and how we get better engaged with schools. I thought that the communities and schools content was terrific too. Thank you so much for being here, Carol. And when you look at the wraparound services, orgs like CIS are so well equipped to provide some of those services and help us engage productively, as David noted, and not get in the way, when it comes to businesses. And then finally, Ken, great comments as well about Learn for Life and the initiatives that we have going on in the metro area. A few things that I took away from today's event. The labor market issues, I thought that David did a great job earlier today. And he really went beyond looking at skills gaps, looking at mechanization, globalization as being some of the factors, and really looking at some of the issues around our tax code and how it actually disincentivizes work. And I think that we can all hope that as we look at tax reform, if that does indeed become a thrust of the new administration, that that issue can be tackled effectively. Some really good data on that. I also think that companies overall, we certainly have a role to play. Companies like Gas South, Graphic Packaging, where David served as CEO for many, many years. And I think we need to be intentional as well about providing training to our workforce, providing opportunity, providing those career maps, setting a vision for how folks can further their careers at our respective companies, the value of an education and going back to school and getting that degree and how that can really change their lives and also change our companies for the better. So that's something that I definitely take away as well and something that I'm very passionate about, very committed to. So I thank you all for being here. I also will note that I would be remiss if I didn't note that we could use your support at the Georgia Partnership for Excellence in Education. We are a an organization that is funded by individuals, by foundations, by companies. And there's a little envelope, I think, in your packages that, and if you would be so kind as you're looking at your year-end charitable contributions, try to consider GPEE as one of the beneficiaries of your generosity. So thank you very much for being here. I hope you have a great day.